They had left Porto Alegre with the memory of rain on a zinc roof still fresh in their minds. When they arrived in Penha, they were met by a sun that promised nothing but beautiful photographs. But amidst the noise of music and laughter, there was a single second when everything fell silent. A door with no sign, a corridor that smelled of glue and damp fabric, and two shadows that vanished within. The last image shows a tight embrace, white gloves against a colorful castle, as if nothing could possibly go wrong. The rest was trapped within windowless walls in a darkness no one ever visited. This is the story of how a day trip became a disappearance that spanned decades, and how, much later, all that returned was a locked room and questions no one had the courage to answer out loud. The road was a film unreeling through the bus window. The BR-101 highway cut across the map, a long ribbon of asphalt, the wind slicing through the fields outside. André held the camera in his lap, the film canister cap tucked safely in his shirt pocket. Camila chewed on the corner of her ticket, the first she had ever bought with her own money, earned at the bookstore. They talked about nothing in particular to chase away the morning chill. Shared a packet of cookies and counted out their coins for a weak coffee at the truck stop, the air thick with the smell of diesel and slightly burnt toast. They had arranged to stay in a simple guest house near Armaço Beach, in a room with a noisy fan and thin curtains that let in the salt from the air. A makeshift clothesline was strung up in the bathroom for clothes washed hastily in the sink. They entered the park before noon, and for a few minutes they let themselves be children again. The colors were dazzling, the buildings looked like television sets, and the ambient music spilled from the speakers with a manufactured joy that, for one day, was enough. Everton Ramos, Tico, a friend from their school days, worked there as a photographer. He spotted them and ran over laughing, offering to take their picture with the park's mascot. Camila fixed her bangs, André loosened his belt, and they stood on either side of the character with its enormous head and fixed smile. A white glove wrapped around her back, and the flash froze the moment in time. It's a clean image from July of 1993. Light-washed jeans, plain t-shirts, the colorful castle behind them, and that Santa Catarina sky, so blue it was almost cruel. They walked along the cobblestone paths, tried a watery ice cream, and got lost in noisy queues where children cried over escaped balloons. The parade with Mickey's crew was set to start at 3. Between one dance and another, André joked that he wanted to see where the sets went to sleep when no one was looking. Camila laughed, tapped his arm with her purse, and told him not to get any funny ideas. But their curiosity was a good thing, the same curiosity that made André open up old radios to understand the static and led Camila to collect bus maps. Tico promised to have the photo developed for them by the time they left, asking them to wait for him near the castle in the late afternoon. Around 4 o'clock, the crowds were dense. The music grew louder, and suddenly their desire for a breath of fresh air broke them from the script. They moved away from the main square, following corridors that felt like streets but always ended at another colorful facade. There were side passages off-limits to the public where the very air changed. The sweet smell of popcorn gave way to the chemical tang of cut foam and shoemaker's glue. Lydia Faraz, a member of the cleaning staff, was pushing her cart when she saw the couple looking at a gray gate, its padlock hanging open. She would later recall Camila's hurried hello, asking if there was a restroom nearby. Lydia told them it was a service area, but the noise of the parade swallowed her words. Her shift was ending, so she kept moving. Behind the gate, the corridor was dim, lit by the hum of cold fluorescent bulbs. André aimed his camera at a sign listing backstage rules, unaware that this roll of film would hold their last fragment of time. A costumed employee hurried past them, the head of his costume tucked under his arm, and simply said, "You can't be here," in a tone that was neither harsh nor kind. They took 2 steps back, hesitating, and Camilla adjusted the plastic wristband that was starting to itch. Just then, the parade music swelled outside and a gust of wind blew an unmarked door open, its latch clicking softly as it swung ajar. Rogerio Merels, from maintenance, would later say that door should never have been loose. It was a service exit, used by staff cutting through the guts of the park to save time. Anyone who entered without knowing the way could find themselves in a labyrinth of bare walls behind fake facades. André, curious, asked for just a minute, and the two of them stepped through. The sounds of the park grew distant like a poorly tuned radio. They walked down a narrow corridor with a rough cement floor speckled with dried paint. The air smelled of damp cloth like a grandmother's old wardrobe. Camila clutched her purse with both hands. She felt her heart beat faster when she noticed the door behind them had swung gently shut. Not locked, just heavy. No one heard running footsteps or screams. What happened was the sum of small details. An employee in a hurry, the slam of a door, a lock someone forgot on its track, a light that flickered and for a moment went out. André tried to retrace their steps, but all the passages looked the same. In the best-case scenario, they would have turned around and left through the same door, but their memory failed them. The route became a confusing sketch. They chose a second door, a low one with tired hinges, and entered a larger, empty room where the rhythmic drip of an unseen leak echoed. There were metal shelves against the walls and the feeling of a makeshift storage area. According to his family, André's watch stopped 2 minutes later, a detail they would only discover when what was left of it was recovered years later. In that moment, for them, it was just a day out that had gone wrong. By the time they realized it, the world outside was already moving on without them. Afternoon turned to evening and the park stuck to its script. Employees counted ticket revenues, collected deflated balloons, and swept the grounds. Tico waited by the castle, his camera around his neck, until the cold coastal wind cut through his clothes and the music finally shut off. He decided to search the nearby area, passing through the gray gate. He called André's name, heard only his own echo, and was startled by the emptiness. Back at the guest house, no one returned. The fan kept spinning in a silent room. The window left ajar let in the salty air that stung the nose. The disappearance at first felt like a simple delay. Within hours, it would become a frontier. When Tico went to the park's reception, the woman at the counter assumed it was just a couple who had been held up in the lines. He insisted, showing her the photo he had taken hours before, the white glove in the middle of the embrace, and asked her to call security. The radio crackled. 2 people in vests went to the main square, asked for names, described their clothing, and followed Tico along the path he remembered. The gray gate was now shut, the padlock secured, the music was gone, and the night air carried the chill of the sea. Within minutes, more staff arrived, men with keychains on their belts and flashlights. The corridor, bustling during the day, now seemed like another place, with metal shadows carving up the floor. Sueli, Camila's mother, answered the phone in Porto Alegre just after midnight. The sound of a passing bus nearly drowned out Tico's trembling voice. She pulled a coat on over her dress. She woke up Walter, who was already in bed after a long haul, and together they insisted it had to be some kind of mistake. In the dead of night, no parent wants to believe the worst. Still, they scraped together what little money they had and hit the road. Walter's truck knew every gas station, every pothole. The AM radio announced rain in Imbituba and a harsh wind, but they drove on, their fingers stiff with cold, praying without words, without any mysticism, just the raw will to get there. Meanwhile, the park's corridors filled with footsteps. Lydia replayed her own voice in her head, saying service area, and her chest tightened. Rogerio called in urgently, put on the face of a man in control, but in that moment he controlled almost nothing. They said they searched the artificial lakes, the backstage areas of the shows, the loading docks, and the large wooden crates used to store scenery. The smell changed again. The sweet joy was gone, replaced by the scent of damp concrete, old paint, and soaked cloth. The night wore on, flashlights cutting across surfaces and names being repeated, as if just saying André and Camila would be enough to bring them back. The day broke to the sound of delivery trucks, and Penha awoke like any other seaside town, with dogs barking, fresh bread baking, and fishermen pushing their boats out to sea. Sueli and Walter arrived, their faces creased from the road, the taste of salt on their lips. They went straight to the park administration, where they were met with rushed explanations and a cup of machine coffee that was good only for warming their hands. Tico found them there, his eyes red. He repeated what he knew, that at 4 he saw the chaos of the lines and then lost sight of the couple, that the hours that followed were a sequence of corridors, gates, and non-answers. Sueli asked to see Andre's camera as if the object itself could reveal a path. The film was still inside. It would only be developed later, and that later would be heavy. The Penha police arrived and asked simple questions. Sueli described her organized daughter, her folded maps, her habit of saving ticket stubs. Walter, with his finger, drew a makeshift map on the table, reconstructing what he had heard about a gray gate and an unmarked door. None of it brought them back. Small, cruel rumors began to circulate, as they always do in a small town when something defies explanation. Someone said they saw them hitchhiking after leaving the park. Someone else swore they heard a muffled scream near a wall. So many things sound possible when the truth refuses to appear. That afternoon, a light rain began to fall. The zinc roof of the guest house at Armaso Beach sang its winter rhythm, and Sueli felt her body fold. Anyone who has ever waited for news in a guest house room with thin curtains knows how time stops running. Walter went out into the street, walking through the dirt that turned to mud at the curb, and asked questions door to door. Tico sat on the sidewalk, the still damp photo in his hand. It was too beautiful a portrait for the moment. The white glove, the fixed smile, the castle behind them, and an unsettling feeling that something in it was held just a little too tight. If you followed the story this far and want to trace every step of this investigation, reconstructed from memory and detail, subscribe to the channel now. It helps us continue telling this story and keeps the case alive in conversation as we return to the park and to what its walls have kept hidden. Night fell again, and the park had to reopen. Business doesn't stop. But there was a closed-off corridor, a new padlock, and a silence that seeped through the cracks. Lydia, consumed by a guilt that wasn't hers, retraced her path from the day before, swearing to herself that she had warned them. Rogerio signed paperwork and made calls, repeating that everything was under control. Sueli and Walter, holding hands, accepted the offer of a room from a manager who didn't know what else to say. Before falling asleep, Sueli opened her daughter's purse, which had been found at the guest house. She ran her hand over the Chimarao keychain and took out the 2 park tickets. She read the date, traced the letters with her finger, and put them back as if they were fragile proof that, just a few days earlier, they had existed in the world. It was only the first day of a wait that would last longer than any of them could imagine they could bear. Time has a way of turning urgency into a calendar of waiting. In the first week, the case filled local radio and newspapers, short segments on TV, and became the unavoidable topic of conversation on the sidewalks of Penha. Sueli put up homemade posters, taping them to payphones and bus stops, while Walter drove the BR 101 from end to end, stopping at truck stops, asking people to look at faces that were already burned into his mind even when he closed his eyes. The family organized vigils in Porto Alegre, with candles lit in the neighborhood square and a cold that seeped right through their clothes. Friends slowly learned to ask, delicately, "Any news?" The answer was almost always no. Tico undertook the difficult task of developing Andre's film. The Photoshop, with its smell of chemicals and red light, returned 30-some images of a very ordinary day. There were smiles, a can of soda resting on a wall, and the picture of the backstage rules sign that Andre had found so curious. The last two exposures came out burnt, as if the world itself had decided to erase a piece of its own memory. Among the photos, a small detail haunted Tico. In one, in the corner of the frame, was the shadow of a half-open door. It could have been any door. It could have been nothing at all. But in the absence of answers, small details grow like weeds. Lydia gave a simple statement in plain terms. She said she saw the couple near the service entrance, that she gave a quiet warning, but the sound of the parade had swallowed her words. Rogerio, pressured by his bosses and his own conscience, drew a map of the corridors, the doors, the escape routes. He said he had checked the latches, verified the padlocks, that the unmarked door was always kept shut. One employee, who wished to remain anonymous, mentioned that some false walls had been put up to hide the mess from ongoing construction. None of it ever yielded a solid lead, but every detail was preserved in a folder with metal clasps, a burden the family would carry with them through the years. The months dragged the case to the end of that year. Summer brought new tourists and new laughter. The park managed to smooth over the disturbance. The backstage area was reorganized. Burned set pieces were replaced, a wall painted over to hide the water stains. Anyone who returns to a childhood place always finds it smaller than they remember. For Sueli, however, it was the opposite. Every service corridor grew longer, casting deep shadows as if hiding answers. She returned to the town many times, staying in different rooms, walking with the same map her daughter had once carefully folded. At night, she wrote in a soft-cover notebook, recording what she discovered and what she thought she had discovered. Between facts and suppositions, the notebook became her companion. Walter took refuge in his work. Driving was his way of deceiving his own mind. At every stop, he would ask. At every workshop, he would leave a copy of the photo. He learned to recognize the reactions in seconds. There were the sympathetic ones. There were those who averted their gaze to escape the discomfort. And there were those who wanted to invent sightings just to feel useful. In the end, he would return home with the same doubt folded in his pocket. In Porto Alegre, the rain on the tin roof seemed to play the same old tune. But now it was a different song. The scent of wet earth that rose from the town square after a summer storm would drift through the window, leaving the living room with the feeling of an infinite Sunday. Tico stopped working at the park months later, not out of bravery but out of sheer exhaustion. He continued his photography, now shooting simple weddings and school graduations, and from time to time he would gaze at the picture of his friends on the shelf. It wasn't guilt, it was longing. He too dreamed of corridors, of doors he could never be sure he had closed. This is how it is for those left behind. The mind becomes a labyrinth with no exit. He tried talking to former colleagues and heard distorted stories of rooms sealed off during renovations, of costumes stored in depots no one ever visited. But people learned to survive the noise of their own doubts. They changed the subject. Years came and went. Some birthdays were celebrated with a cake cut in half at Sueli's house, as if the other half belonged to the one who would not arrive in time. The candles were lit and blown out with care, and no one made a speech. On major anniversaries, the press would remember. A reporter from Joinville sought out the family and reconstructed the day with measured steps. She walked through the square, photographed the castle, and used a tape measure to mark the distance to the gray gate, which was now a different color. In her article, she wrote that there were gaps and contradictions. Pretty words for what was, in practice, the hole in the chest of those who wait. The decade turned, and the case endured as a story told in half-light. In Penha, taxi drivers could summarize the plot in 3 sentences. Waiters would point, discreetly. The management of the park would acknowledge it. Old and former employees exchanged messages with caution. One of them, now living far away, said that during the construction period, it was common practice to seal off whatever was no longer useful. To seal off can mean many things. It can mean to paint over, to push aside, to erect a temporary wall that becomes permanent. Anyone who did not live that routine might never understand how small, everyday decisions can draw the map of someone's destiny. And so it was, with life moving on, stumbling forward, that 2010 arrived. The park was in need of renovations, new regulations, fresh coats of paint. Foremen, bricklayers, and men with tape measures and cement dust clinging to their sweat moved in. Jair Nunes was leading the crew in a forgotten sector of the park. It was there, behind a maintenance corridor, that a different vibration in the echo caught his attention. They tapped lightly on the wall. The sound that came back was hollow. Jair chalked an X on the spot and said, "Let's try here." No one knew in that moment that a part of the country would soon hold its breath at what would emerge from the dust. The chalk X was only the beginning. Jair Nunes pressed his ear to the wall and heard the hollowness, as if someone had left a cabinet behind it. The team ran an extension cord. Dust billowed as the circular saw bit into the wall, and the smell of old cement filled the corridor. When the section of masonry finally gave way, it released a damp, heavy gust of air, reminiscent of an old basement after days of rain. They opened an irregular mouth in the plaster and aimed a flashlight inside. The circle of light found rusted shelves, remnants of fabric, long streaks of water stains running down the wall, and at the far end 2 human forms sitting on the floor, leaning against each other as if they had rested and never risen again. Jair ordered the tools to be lowered. For a few seconds, no one spoke. It was the kind of silence you recognize in your body before your mind can comprehend. One of the masons, by force of habit, made the sign of the cross. Another took a step back. Jair took a deep breath, called for calm, and phoned the sector manager, who was there in minutes. The room was about 6 by 4 meters, with a low ceiling, a rough cement floor, and a single ventilation point that had been boarded up long ago. The flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing what would later be confirmed: 2 skeletons, side by side, their clothes still clinging in tatters, a faded white t-shirt and jeans on one, a light blue t-shirt and jeans on the other. Near one of their feet lay a shattered wristwatch. Beside it, a denim bag, hardened by the damp. In the corner, leaning on its side, was the head of a mouse costume, soiled, its foam surface deformed by time. They called the city authorities and sealed the area with tape. Jair did what he knew to do. He kept his team back, closed off access, and waited. The first to enter wore simple masks against the mold and dust. There was no smell of fresh death, but an ancient staleness that clung to the nostrils. A cardboard-covered notebook was found under an overturned shelf, waterlogged and unrecognizable. There were also rusty hangers, a lidless box with scraps of royal blue fabric, and a large, old-fashioned padlock key on the floor near the inner door, as if it had rolled there and been left to dry. The words spoken that morning were measured. Jair answered the basics: that the room was not on the current park map, that his team had found the wall strange because of the echo, that he didn't know how long it had been sealed. Later, looking at the photos they had taken with a work phone, he would see details he had missed at first. A paint line on the door frame showing a door had once been there, and a patch of plaster of a different texture at the height of a latch, as if someone had filled the hole from the outside. The corridor, meanwhile, showed recent wheelbarrow tracks, but also older scratches covered in a layer of dust. The news traveled fast. Within hours, journalists had parked their cars in the lot, asking more questions than anyone had answers for. The park, accustomed to controlling what is seen and heard, fought the impulse to send them all away. There was a limit to how much reality could be airbrushed. Jair watched it all from a distance, his clothes impregnated with that stubborn dust. In the afternoon, someone commented in a low voice that, years ago, they used to cover up anything that got in the way, that it was common to put up makeshift partitions in technical areas. The sentence hung in the air like construction dust, visible in a shaft of light slowly settling on everything. Sueli was at home in Porto Alegre when she received the call. Her legs gave out. The young man's voice on the other end used euphemisms that did nothing to change the meaning. 2 sets of remains had been found in a sealed-off area of the park. She called for Walter and, without thinking, began to pack the small suitcase just like on the first day. It was no longer out of hope. It was out of duty. The truck didn't go this time. They borrowed a car from her brother-in-law and drove down the highway, the same wind beating against the windows, the same smell of hot coffee at the rest stops, but a weight inside the car that no gear could push forward. In Penha, the late afternoon, brightened by the cold light of floodlamps, revealed a scene already documented and covered with tarps, the corridor under guard, and a sense that the entire town had been told a secret it did not want to keep. Tico came from the neighboring city of Itajaí, where he now lived, and found Sueli standing with her arms crossed, her breathing short. He held her hand and said only, "I'm here." The scene, as harsh as it was, brought a perverse kind of relief. There was a place, a point on the map, an address for their loss. The mystery was unraveling, but the explanation was still far from fitting into a single sentence. The next morning, they removed the remains with care. They collected pieces of clothing, the stopped watch, the bag, the corroded tickets, and the park map, all packaged like one would wrap something that is more than just an object. The costume head was last, heavy with mold and symbolism. An older employee who avoided getting too close said he was certain that room had once been used for costume storage. "Back then," he said, scratching his chin, "you just shove in whatever didn't fit anymore." The phrase could have been about so many things. The country would see the images on television news programs that seemed to be narrating another reality. And Sueli, looking out at the Penha Sea, dark under a cloudy morning sky, thought of her daughter, who had loved to organize her drawers and would never have left a bag thrown on the floor. Life is made of small coherences. The room was not. The days that followed were filled with procedure and slents. The remains were sent for analysis, and the families, supported by the simple kindness of the townspeople, waited in guesthouse rooms where the smell of the sea fought with the smell of disinfectant. No one promised timelines. What they had were comparisons. Dental records from Porto Alegre, measurements of bone fragments, objects that pointed to small personal histories. Andre's watch, a gift from his father for his first job, Camila's bag, with the Chimero keychain now coated in a layer of rust. The plastic wristbands, blue and white, were still recognizable, twisted by time. The park map, its pages fused together by years of humidity, bore a pencil mark tracing a route between the main square and the back area. It was the drawing of a day that never ended. The family hired a private civil expert to follow the case from the outside. Helena Bittencourt, discreet and soft-spoken, sat with Sueli and Walter in a corner bakery and explained in simple terms what she would do. Visit the site, photograph the surroundings, examine doors, latches, frames, traces of plaster. push marks, possible pathways. She promised no miracles. She promised a human reading of it all, an attempt to assemble the pieces without forcing any of them to fit. In the following days, she measured the width of the corridor, timing her steps to the room. 1.5 meters from the floor, she found a circle of plaster of a slightly different shade, right where a lock would have been. On the floor, by the inner door frame, the dust was a different color, as if it had sealed something there in the past. These are signs that, on their own, are not enough, but together they form a probable narrative. A door had been dismantled, a wall had been erected, and for those inside, the world on the other side had ceased to exist. The clothes, seen up close, told a more intimate story. The blue t-shirt, though now almost gray, had its sleeves rolled up just the way André used to in old photos. The white one, stiffened by moisture, had a small hand-stitched seam on the right side, Sueli's handiwork from months before the trip. The watch, stopped at 4:32, had a chipped crystal, as if it had struck a sharp corner. The padlock key on the floor opened nothing there. It seemed to be for a lock that had been replaced. This sparked a hypothesis in Helena's mind. The room could have been used for temporary storage, with an improvised lock on the outside. Then in some hurried routine, it became a permanent depot. If someone had entered unseen, they were forgotten along with the objects. The official reports came, written with necessary caution and an honest margin of uncertainty. The match with André and Camila was confirmed, cross-referencing genetic material with close relatives and dental records. There were no obvious signs of mechanical violence on the visible remains. The position of the bodies, seated and leaning, suggested a voluntary entry and an impossible exit. The bag with the tickets and a packet of tissues indicated they were in the middle of their day, not ready to leave. The large, awkward costume head made sense in a storage room. It made less sense next to two young people who should never have been there. Helena returned to the room after the park had closed to understand the acoustics. She asked for silence and knocked with her knuckles on the new wall and then the old one. The feedback was different. At the time of the disappearance, a parade with loud music would have had a serious effect on any cry for help coming from within. Furthermore, the inner door was heavy with a handle that did not spring back automatically. A gust of wind would have been enough to close it. It is easy to imagine the small mistake. One step too far, curiosity a hand's breadth further. The door swinging shut behind them, the handles slipping from their grasp. In the dark, identical doors seemed different, and in a place where the priority was to hide the backstage, it is plausible that the next priority was to disguise any unwanted passageways. Sueli followed every development with the fortitude of someone who has already fought a long war. She wasn't looking for a culprit, at least not by that name. She was searching for a credible sequence of events so that she could finally sit down and breathe. Walter at her side held up the practical questions. Who signs for this? Who was watching that sector? Who decided to put up the wall? Sometimes the answer to such questions isn't a person but a collection of habits. Lost paperwork, changes in management, failing memories, and the momentum of a machine that simply pushes the day forward. At the end of that week, the park maintained a short official statement. It said they were cooperating with the authorities, that they were deeply sorry, and that they would provide support to the families. It was bureaucratic text for a void too vast to fit in a press release. When the sun set behind the simple houses of Penha, Helena closed her notebook and said something to Sueli, a phrase that solved nothing but brought a small measure of peace. What happened to them wasn't because of who they were, but because of where they were. Somewhere between the gray gate, the unmarked door, and the rush of a busy day, André and Camila became part of the park's hidden mess. And so they were forgotten, not out of explicit malice, but through an accumulation of oversights that together did what no one could undo. The wake in Penha was discreet. A cold wind blew in from the sea, lifting the corners of the tarp. Townsfolk stood in silence on the sidewalk. A few former park employees approached without their name badges, hands in their pockets, offering short nods. Tico placed a copy of the castle photo on a side table. It was unframed, just the paper saturated with the colors of the 90s. Sueli ran a hand over the portrait gently as one might stroke a person's hair. She didn't cry the whole time. No one can. She would stop, look out at the sea, breathe, and then turn back. Beside her, Walter took phone calls, jotted down the names of people who said they wanted to help, and tucked each note into his wallet, like fragments of a debt the world now owed them. At the municipal cemetery, the earth was damp, and the smell of cut grass rose sharply. There was no official speech. A man from the neighborhood read a random passage from a book that wasn't even religious. It was about taking care. The sound of shovels striking the bottom of the grave mixed with the song of a bird no one could identify. Life has these ironies. What was left of André and Camila returned to the earth just a few kilometers from the place they had gone for a day out. "We just wanted them to come home," Sueli said to no one in particular, looking down at her hands, at her short nails, at the inside of her own story. The national attention brought back old theories. Talk shows hammered away at the enigma. Some newspapers insisted on sensationalized versions. In Porto Alegre, neighbors knocked on Sueli's door to bring pies, bread, and hot broth in a thermos. It's the small gestures that sustain you. The park, for its part, redesigned its access points, installed doors with horizontal push bars for easy opening, created more honest backstage maps, and trained new staff. Not all of this was visible. Some repairs were internal, a matter of routine. Rogerio Meireles, aged by time and the weight of the years, took an early retirement. Lydia, who now worked in another city, wrote a handwritten letter to Sueli. "I tried to warn them that day. I still remember you all." Sueli kept the letter folded inside the soft-cover notebook she'd had since 1993. Helena Bittencourt submitted her humanized report. Without casting blame, she pointed out the obvious. Service access ways were confusing to visitors. The room was likely sealed after the disappearance, and the most plausible hypothesis was an accident compounded by a structural concealment. Not the kind of cover-up meant to last forever, but the kind of temporary fix that becomes permanent because urgency demands it. The document also spoke of the acoustics. A parade with speakers at full blast would have muffled any cries for help coming from behind the walls. It mentioned the position of the bodies, the absence of any signs of a struggle, and the collection of objects. A map, tickets, a watch, a purse composing a frozen timeline. Months later, Tico returned to the park on a quiet day. He walked through the main square, stepped on the same cobblestones, and touched a railing he had never noticed before. He felt anger, and he felt a deep sense of loss. He bought a lukewarm soda and watched tourists take pictures with costumed characters, their oversized heads and foam hands unchanged since 1993. No one there knew his name. He took the highway home with the window down, the wind carrying the scent of wet earth from the roadside. He pulled the car over at a safe spot, took a breath, and called Sueli. "I'm coming over for coffee," he said. It was the way they had found to keep going. In Porto Alegre, the Dornelles house always had a full thermos and a jar of cookies on the table. On rainy afternoons, the familiar sound of drops on the tin roof provided a companionship that no longer hurt so much. Sueli would sometimes open her notebook and reread old entries like someone visiting a place without ever leaving their chair. On one page, a crooked drawing of the corridor with an X where the door should have been. On another, a list of names of those who helped, from the truck driver who gave them a ride to the reporter who called on the anniversary of the disappearance. Nowhere was the word end. It was a book of chapters that grew shorter but continued on. The question that remains is not just what happened, but why it took so long for anyone to see. The difference between a corridor and a labyrinth, in the end, is a well-made map. André and Camila, young in their light-washed jeans and eager to peek at the machinery behind the magic, were captured by a confluence of common curiosity and the carelessness of others. It's a harsh truth, but a plausible one. They went in, the door swung shut, they lost their bearings, and the place that should have been an exit became a wall. With time came construction, and the easy solution was to seal it off. It was silence. Sueli no longer searches for any corridors. She tends to the plants on her windowsill, cooks for her nephews and nieces, and sometimes when she's at the coast, she visits the cemetery in Penha. She leaves simple flowers and touches a finger to the engraved name. She doesn't ask the wind for explanations. She doesn't expect some grand justice. She only asks that no one else gets lost because of a misplaced wall. Is that a reasonable request in a country where so much is patched together with improvisation? The case became a story told with respect in conversations, at bar tables on the bus line between Penha and Balneario. And every time someone passes the colorful castle and feels the joy of a day of freedom, there is also in the background the memory that between facades and backstages, there are doors that should never be closed. Helena always started with what she could touch. Walls, doors, pathways. On paper, she drew their probable route from the photo at the castle to the gray gate, following what Lydia remembered and what Tico had repeated 1,000 times. Reconstructing it minute by minute is an exercise in humility because the air of that day is gone, but some movements are almost obvious. They leave the main square as the music swells, looking for a moment of quiet. They find the gate ajar, see a cold corridor with white fluorescent lights and a low, unmarked door. Back here, everything was practical. A place to shorten walks, hide machinery, store sweat-drenched costumes. Camila touches her plastic wristband. André wants to photograph the posters. The door swings shut. It doesn't lock, but it's heavy. Curiosity pulls them one step too far. The room has the feel of an improvisation that became a habit. Metal shelves pushed against a wall, stacked fabrics, scraps of wood covered in paint. An old window had been boarded up long ago, leaving only a tiny slit high up, not enough to relieve the stuffy heat. The central light had a switch on the outside. Anyone who entered in the dark would have had to feel their way. Helena noticed an almost invisible detail on the door frame. Old drag marks, as if something heavy had been propped against the door from the inside. She imagined a character's head resting there, later rolled into a corner. One can picture André trying the handle 2 or 3 times. It gives halfway and then springs back. Outside, the parade devours the afternoon with the beat of a bass drum and the blare of brass. The sound is a distraction, but it is also an insulator. Anyone who has tried to shout in a stadium during a concert knows a voice cannot cut through. The acoustics of the corridor work against them. If someone banged on the door from the inside, the sound would have become just another random noise to anyone passing by on the outside, carrying boxes. At this point, the options are few. Either someone shows up by chance or the couple tries to return to the corridor and takes a wrong turn in the sequence of identical doors. Helena's drawing showed 5 similar doorways in a short L shape. Confuse one and you lose your reference point. The room where they were found was at the very end. For a moment, it must have seemed like a safe place, a temporary shelter. The door closed, and in that environment, closing it was almost the same as locking it. The proof that they tried to get out wasn't in dramatic marks, but in the subtle details. The position of the skeletons pointing toward the door, the watch, stopped after a slight impact, the purse placed near the threshold as if it had been opened in search of something useful. There were no bottles, no water, only the humid air fermenting old cloth. At night, the park closes backstage. A skeleton crew remains exhausted. The combination of doors, noise, and shift changes makes two people invisible inside a mapless labyrinth. The next day, it all begins again, and the room goes back to being a storage closet. Time stretches everything, and it changes the memory of places. Weeks after that July, someone gives an order to tidy up the sector for another season of shows. Partitions go up. A hired bricklayer slaps on mortar, filling a gap. He applies a quick finish to make the area look presentable. No safety tape, no sign, no record. The improvisations of construction work become permanent when no one writes anything down. The new wall demands silence from what lies behind it. The corridor, already quiet, disappears from the usual routes and becomes just another sealed-off corner. The old key Helena saw on the floor might not have opened anything since the day someone replaced all the locks in bulk. Sueli, who doesn't like suppositions, allowed herself to listen to this entire narrative one afternoon. Helena speaks directly without melodrama. She explains that accidents aren't monsters, they are ordinary steps poorly combined. Walter, silent, chews on a piece of hard bread from the bakery and asks about the time. How long can a person last in those conditions? Helena avoids the calculation. She says that in an environment without proper ventilation, with a heavy door and noise outside, the body exacts its toll quickly. This isn't a movie, this is a prison that looks like a room. At night, Tico takes the highway and pulls over at a safe spot, listening to the sound of distant cars like the ocean of the road. He remembers André laughing at simple things, Camila jotting down schedules on small pieces of paper. He feels a rage at the architecture of illusion, which on that day was not an innocent park game, but a real wall. The cold wind seeps through the cracks and leaves the smell of wet earth on the car seat. Tico records a voice message for Sueli saying that the memory he wants to keep is the one from before the corridor. The hug in front of the castle, the big foam glove, and the simple t-shirts. The pain exists, but the before is also part of the story. At the end of that week, Helena returns to the now empty room wearing a mask against the mold. She places a hand on the wall that replaced the old exit and tries to imagine who built it, without inventing villains. The problem, she writes in her report, isn't a single person. It is a culture that prefers to patch over a problem rather than fix it and document it. She leaves the park before dark, walking down a street that smells of fried pastries and gasoline, and continues on to the beach. The winter wind is cold, lifting fine sand, and the water laps at the shore in short rhythmic waves like a clock. The town will go to sleep early. In many houses, the TV will be talking about the case. In others, there will be a respectful silence. The country has its answer. The family has a place to leave flowers. But still missing are the pages that tell you what to do with it all. Helena decided to follow the bureaucratic trail the way an ordinary person can, requesting copies of old invoices, talking to anyone who remembered signing a materials request. In the archives of a supplier in Itajaí, she found a record for a delivery of concrete blocks and 2 large cans of acrylic paint for an internal sector, with no further specification made weeks after July 1993. Nothing definitive, but the coincidence throbbed. In Penha, she spoke with a retired bricklayer. He didn't remember the case by name, but he recalled closing up a hole near a technical corridor in a park because it looked bad when they opened the gate. He spoke as he stirred his filtered coffee in an enamel mug, the strong aroma filling his simple kitchen. Back then, he said, it was common to do quick fixes for the next season. Haste and care do not go together. Rogerio Mireles agreed to meet Sueli at a bakery. Age had given him a different rhythm. He watched the steam rise from a cheese bread and said he didn't want to make excuses. He just wanted to say that the park in those days was a work in progress, one patch on top of another. He told her that after the disappearance, they spent weeks checking doors, but that routine swallows even the best of intentions. He didn't know or didn't want to say who decided to build a wall where there had been a door. Sueli listened calmly, and at one point she said something that wasn't an accusation but a statement of fact. If someone had just drawn the path correctly, maybe they would have come back. Rogerio nodded, his eyes downcast, and paid for the coffee without looking at the bill. The park offered to cover the transport of the bodies, the funeral expenses, and assistance for anyone who needed to travel. It wasn't a newspaper ad in bold letters, it was a polite message delivered through a manager. Sueli accepted what was practical and refused what felt like an attempt to end the conversation. What mattered most to her was a clear commitment to change. Some of those changes were already visible. Doors with horizontal push bars, restricted access signs with drawings that left no room for doubt, gates with sensors. Others were invisible, training sessions, redesigned routes, meetings with the cleaning and maintenance crews, the true eyes and ears of the park. The world doesn't go back, but it can learn. Tico, who worked as an event photographer, decided to put together a small exhibition with images from the case and portraits of ordinary hallways from anywhere: schools, hospitals, gymnasiums. The series was titled, "What Doesn't Fit in the Frame." He printed the photos on matte paper and hung them with double-sided tape in a room borrowed from a neighborhood library. People entered in silence, ran a light hand over the captions, and left thinking about the number of doors we all walk through without reading the signs. It wasn't art for sale, it was a gesture so that friends would not become mere statistics. Helena stayed in Penha for a few more days, discreetly meeting with former employees who came to speak off the record. One of them told her that the fantasy character's head found in the room had been left there because it took up too much space in the closet and, since it was no longer in use, had been set aside. Another said he never understood why some access points had two possible exits, but not a single arrow. None of this proved anything on its own, but together the details built the perfect stage for what happened. It wasn't a plot, it was carelessness. And carelessness, when it becomes a habit, wreaks havoc on a grand scale. In Porto Alegre, routine began to return to a possible shape. Sueli tidied Camila's room one last time, put away what needed to be stored, and left the soft-cover notebook and the photo of the castle on the desk. Walter went back to his hauling jobs. In the late afternoons, when the sky burns orange behind the buildings and packed buses rock along the avenue, he rests his head on the steering wheel for a minute before driving on. It's not a prayer, not a promise, just a silence that is enough to close the day. The city of Penha, with its simple restaurants serving fried fish and salt caked on the windows, learned to live with the case without turning everything into an attraction. There was respect. The sealed-off room became an internal example of how not to do things. Jair, the construction foreman, made it a permanent habit to check for echoes before tearing down walls. He tells this with an awkward laugh, like someone who knows that prudence is the only possible hero in stories like this. When he crosses paths with Sueli, he dips his chin in a brief nod. No long conversation is needed. They are two people who recognize each other by what they were forced to see on a windy night. Helena says her goodbyes. She leaves Sueli a bound copy of the report marked with yellow sticky notes. It doesn't answer everything, she says, but it draws a path. Sueli clutches it to her chest as if holding a baby. It's not a solution. It's a survival guide. The family decides that from then on, the case will have a future only in the form of a useful memory. If a single door is kept open because someone remembered this story, that will be some kind of possible justice. On the corner, a red motorcycle rumbles past. The smell of burnt gasoline hangs in the air. Life goes on as it always does, and that is precisely the point. As the national buzz subsided, the silent stage of reorganizing one's own mind began. The funeral had given grief a body, but absence is a beast that always returns. Sueli created small rituals, making coffee early in the morning and leaving out an extra cup, even if no one would drink it. Watering the plants on the windowsill, listening to the faint sound of buses on the street. Going to the market with a cloth bag that Camila had liked. There was no mysticism in it, only discipline for days that insisted on bending out of shape. Walter began to collect the stories he heard on the highway in a black notebook. Drivers who had lost people, people who had lost their way. For each story he drew two arrows that intersected. At the top of the page he wrote, "Things that cannot be forgotten." On the Santa Catarina coast, the park truly adopted a new map. Visitors now saw clear signs, frank arrows, and backstage doors with bars that opened effortlessly from the inside. In meetings, managers began to invite the cleaning staff and maintenance technicians to give their opinions on the routes. Lydia, though now working in another city, received a note thanking her for mentioning the service area she had tried to point out in the confusion of the parade. It was a belated way of saying that simple voice matter. Rogerio, no longer in his position, insisted that the staff cafeterias have a bulletin board with updated routes and emergency contacts. He never spoke publicly about the case, but he carried with him the need to fix what could still be fixed. In 2011, Tico and some friends organized a quiet walk from the castle to a spot near the hallway where the wall had been found. It wasn't a protest, it was a remembrance. Each person carried a flower from their own garden. Passers-by slowed their pace, not knowing what it was about, and asked quietly. Someone explained in a low voice without turning it into a spectacle. In the end, the flowers were left in a plastic vase in front of the small, now marked door. Beside it was a sign that read, "Backstage, restricted access." A security guard watched from a distance and raised his chin in a brief salute. A little girl, too young to understand, asked her mother why she couldn't go in there. The mother replied, "Because inside isn't for playing, sweetie." Helena moved on with her life, taking on other civil investigations, but she kept in touch with Sueli through short letters. In one, she mentioned that she had adopted the habit of pressing her ear to walls before authorizing a demolition anywhere. "You can't hear the past," she wrote, "but you can hear the hollowness." Sueli laughed to herself in the kitchen. She taped the sentence to the refrigerator door. Below it was a photo of Armacel Beach on a gray, beautiful day, the sea looking like a crumpled tablecloth. There were those who tried to turn the case into an urban legend with fantastical details and invented characters, the old temptation to embellish pain. The family did not feed it. When asked, Sueli would say what she knew, and only that. "They went into the wrong place and couldn't get out. Then it was sealed up. It took us a long time to find them." As simple as that. What is frightening about that sentence is not the mystery, but the plausibility. In a country of improvisation and tight deadlines, a mistake can linger for decades like an unlit beacon. Over time, the story took on the shape of a cautionary tale in tourism courses and at safety events in parks and stadiums. Tico was invited to speak at a technical school in Balneario Camboriú. He brought the photo of the castle, spoke slowly, and showed the old park map and the new one with the revised routes. He said that the difference between them was not just in the design, but in the decision not to hide what exists behind the facades. He spoke of the smell of damp cloth, the rough cement floor, and the noise that swallows your voice. Someone from the back asked if he had forgiven them. He replied, "It's not a matter of forgiving or not. It's a matter of no one else ever getting lost like that." In Porto Alegre, a cold wind would sometimes blow through, making the house creak. On those days, Sueli liked to cook beans with plenty of garlic, letting the aroma fill the rooms. She would invite her nephews over to eat, and they would talk about soccer, the rain, the late bus. Everyday life has a healing power. In the soft-cover notebook she had started in 1993, she wrote a new chapter, After the Wall. In it, she listed names not to assign blame but to give thanks. A friend who stayed, the foreman who heard the echo, the professional who measured with calm, the employee who said they sealed up whatever got in the way. At the bottom of the page, she jotted down an idea. To gather all the materials from the case, photos, maps, the report, into a small folder to donate to the city library. Not to exhibit pain, but so that students could learn from it. The city of Penha, with its days of blazing sun and nights of sticky humidity, kept turning. Tourists came and went. Cars with out-of-state plates filled the parking spots near the beach. Those who knew the story would sometimes point to a corner and say, "It was there, and nothing more." Memory finds ways to settle in without becoming an attraction. On the one-year anniversary of the room's discovery, Sueli returned with Walter and Tico. They left 3 roses in a nearby flower bed. They drank a watery coffee at a corner kiosk and spent some time watching children run with balloons. The noise of the park seemed less invasive that day, not because it had grown quieter, but because inside them there was finally space for other sounds to enter. There were still questions, but they had learned to sit at the table without knocking over the glasses. At the Penha Municipal Library, Sueli handed over the blue folder containing everything she had. The photo in front of the castle, a copy of the yellowed map, Helena's report with its pen-marked pages. She asked that it be kept in the local history section, not to become a spectacle, but to serve as a reminder of how to prevent. The clerk, a young woman with a soft voice, received the materials as one accepts a baby in their arms. Outside, the cold wind carried the scent of the sea mixed with the smell of fried fish. And Walter remarked that the city would always have this salty taste of farewell and embrace. It was the first time he felt that the case, besides belonging to them, belonged to an entire place. Months later, Rogerio called Helena. He wanted to tell her that he had found, among old papers, a request for materials that coincided with the time the room was sealed. It didn't say wall. It didn't say seal. Only readjustment of a technical corridor. He wasn't seeking absolution. He just wanted to take the information out of his pocket and put it on the right table. They met at a roadside cafe with the sound of trucks rushing past and the smell of fresh coffee. Helena listened, took notes, and said that documents are important not for pointing fingers in the dark, but for mapping out the steps. The country is full of renovations that never make it to a blueprint, and what separates a good intention from a disaster is written memory. Jair, the foreman, stayed on the job. His crew developed a new quirk. They would tap their hammers on any wall they were about to tear down. The echo gave back stories. "It sounds silly, but I sleep better," he would say, showing a thumb with an old callus and a cement-stained nail. At home, he would tell his young daughter, a Brazilian who would grow up with a different notion of safety, that good work doesn't depend on an inauguration plaque, but on small, unglamorous acts of care, repeated over and over. In a notebook, he would write, "Check exits, test handles, keep corridors clear." It was a mantra. Lydia, who now cleaned the hallways of a convention center in Joinville, carried the memory of that unheard warning about the service area like a beautiful, heavy, and necessary stone in her pocket. Whenever she saw a propped open door in a restricted area, she would close it and leave a taped note. Staff only. Emergency exit next door. Her simple handwriting once saved a distracted old woman who was looking for the restroom. Lydia smiled to herself and kept pushing her cleaning cart. She didn't become a hero of anything. She became an agent of routine, which is what truly sustains a place. Tico, restless, decided to go back to Andre's camera negatives. Not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a friend's duty. In an old dark room under the red safe light, his hands wet with cold chemicals, he carefully scanned the images. The shadow of a door, the diagonal of a handrail, a blur that could have been a costume being carried in a hurry. From these, he assembled a small visual timeline starting from noon. The photos didn't provide new answers, but they offered something that time nearly erases: the texture of the minutes. In a discreet frame, he placed a copy of Andre's watch. Stopped at 4:32, the watch had stopped. The world had not. The exhibition toured schools, and teenagers stared for a long time at the large glove embracing the two of them. Some said, "It looks like a picture of my parents." That was the point. In Porto Alegre, the Dornell's house once again filled with the sounds of pots and pans, the smell of onions in the frying pan, and visits from relatives who arrived with bags of bread, and stories of buses breaking down on Assis Brazil Avenue. Sueli kept the extra cup next to the stove and spoke of Camila in the present tense. Not to deny the loss, but to prevent the girl from becoming only the past. She would tell stories of her daughter's slightly crooked smile, her habit of folding maps, of always carrying tissues in her purse. Walter, between hauling jobs, would stop at highway rest stops. He'd listen to AM radio stations with news of rain on the plateau, fill his tank, and think about the hallway that no longer existed. It is a way of moving forward, to gather up the small things and give them the dignity of an entire world. There was no shortage of people who tried to turn the story into a media trial. Lawyers appeared discreetly, offering long legal battles. The family listened and thanked them. There was, yes, room to demand accountability. But there was something more: the desire not to reduce Andre and Camila to a lawsuit. Sueli preferred to invest her energy in what she could touch. She went to meetings at universities, spoke at event management courses, and offered her own experience as a blueprint for prevention. Not out of heroism, but because keeping your schedule busy is better than keeping only your heart busy. 1 year, 2, 3. The city saw other headlines. The park opened new attractions. Children from other regions ran along the same cobblestone streets. On milestone dates, someone would remember. The rain on the tin roof in Porto Alegre continued to mark the rhythm of the nights, and that family, which had learned to live with absence, invented a form of presence. Organized memory. On an ordinary Sunday, Sueli opened the window and smelled the wet earth rising from the square below. A small smile. It was a sign of rain, the common destiny of every roof. He picked up the soft-cover notebook and wrote. The two of them were on vacation, but the world was not. Over time, the case became a practical lesson. In 2014, a training course for park and event center monitors invited Helena and Tico for an emergency simulation. The group walked through corridors, tested doors, and checked if handles would open with a simple push. At every corner, Helena would ask someone to stop and describe what they saw. A clear sign, a visible arrow, an unobstructed exit route. The exercise seemed obvious, but it wasn't. At one point, a side gate was unlocked, leading to an area with no easy way back. A young man raised his hand and reported the risk. The coordinator took a note and ordered it fixed. It's not epic, it's necessary. And this was the kind of effect that the story of André and Camila began to have wherever it was told. In Penha, amidst blue sky days and the biting winter wind, Jair continued to work with the calm of someone who had learned to listen to walls. When he came across lost tourists, he would point the way with a broad hand and a brief smile. He never mentioned his part in anything, but the way he looked at the corners of the park held a kind of silent commitment. At home, his grown daughter studied for exams under the glow of a yellow lamp. On quiet nights, he would pass by her room and see her tracing maps, memorizing test routes. He found it beautiful that life sometimes weaves simple patterns in return. Those who learn to close things off also learn to open them up better. Swelly and Walter invited their nephews for a trip to the coast, not to revisit the pain but to change the scenery. They ate fried fish from aluminum plates. They laughed at the little ones who got covered in flour. They walked along the water's edge, the wind pushing them back. Without any drama, they passed near the park. They didn't go in. From a distance, Swelly looked at the colorful towers and thought of the income that supports the town's families. The girl at the ticket booth, the young man operating the sound system, the crew that keeps the bathrooms clean. Grave mistakes do not erase the labor of those who wake up early. She kept walking, her coat zipped up to her chin, feeling the sea spray cling to her hair. Tico, with his small traveling exhibition, arrived at a high school in Navegantes. The students asked the questions every young person asks. Why didn't anyone hear? Why didn't anyone see? Why did it take so long? He took a breath and explained that the world is a noisy place and that heavy doors are easily forgotten when there's no map. He spoke about the power of well-established routines, of taking notes, of reviewing, of asking questions. He ended by showing the photo of the embrace in the castle. The silence in the room was the most eloquent response. Afterwards, a girl in white sneakers approached him. She said she worked weekends at a snack bar and that, from now on, she would check the emergency exits before opening for customers. Tico returned home with the feeling that this, too, is what stories are for. Rogerio grew old without an audience. On a gray afternoon, he asked to speak with Helena again. They sat on a park bench. He told her about a night in 1993 when he thought he'd heard banging on a wall but dismissed it as the wind or the metal of the stage settling. I should have gone back, he confessed, not seeking forgiveness. Helena, without sugarcoating anything, replied that the past cannot be moved, but the present can change direction thanks to the courage it takes to admit a failure. He nodded and they sat in silence, watching a boy fly a kite between the power lines. Above them, the sky was cut by wires and the promise of rain. In late 2018, the Penha Library organized a reading night with materials from the case. Old residents showed up. Curious young people sat on the floor. A teacher asked Sueli how she imagined their last moments. Sueli closed her eyes and spoke simply. They went where they weren't supposed to go. They couldn't figure out how to get back, and they waited for someone to open the door. No one did. The room breathed as one. There was no applause, only respect. Afterwards, they served weak coffee and cream cookies. Memory needs a little sugar sometimes. The years passed. In 2020, a quieter winter brought short, cold waves to the sea. The town slowed its pace, but the local conversation about public safety never stopped. The park, even on lean days, maintained its training, its signs, its inspections. The culture of simply patching things up, at least in that corner of the map, began to fade. And while it's true that the country is vast and unequal, it's also true that examples can trickle from one place to another, like rainwater on a tin roof. Sometimes it leaks through the cracks, but it eventually reaches the ground. At home, Sueli opened the soft-cover notebook and on the last page wrote 3 sentences. that their story was not a legend, it was real life. That the most likely explanation, an accident compounded by a hasty cover-up, offered no comfort, but it made sense. And that moving forward didn't mean closing the book, but knowing where it sits on the shelf. She placed the notebook beside the extra teacup and the dish towel with the embroidered flower. She turned off the lights, lay down and listened for a moment to the rumble of the late-night bus. The sound came through the window as always, and with it came a small peace, which is the only kind there is. In early 2024, Helena passed through Penha again for a short work trip and called Sueli. They had coffee at a plastic table on the sidewalk, watching the morning unfold. They talked about the weather, about buses, about which plants grow best in winter. When they finally touched upon the subject, the lump in their throats was gone. The pain had not turned to stone, it had turned to solid ground. Afterwards, they walked to the beach and watched the horizon tremble slightly in the heat. If we'd had a better map, would they have come back? Sueli asked, not to reopen the wound, but to measure the scar. Maybe, Helena said, promising no miracles. And they both accepted the honesty of that word. Tico arrived later, carrying a box with copies of his exhibition. He wanted to donate them to the library and the local technical school. The images, more worn now, still held the power of remembrance. He spoke of his friend who fixed old radios, of the woman who collected maps, and of the costume head that had become an unwitting symbol. It's very easy to hide what makes us uncomfortable, he said. The hard part is keeping in sight what saves us. They left the materials with the librarian and continued on foot, cutting through a street of simple houses with colorful clotheslines and the smell of lunch beginning to cook. For a moment, they seemed like an ordinary family running ordinary errands. And they were. The park was still there, a part of the city that provided jobs, income, and joy. At some point in the afternoon, a child pulled on his father's hand and pointed to a service gate. The sign was clear, with arrows for the restrooms, the exits, and guest services. The father thanked him for the tip and changed course. It was a banal scene, so banal that no one would remember it. And that is precisely the point of it all. To transform risk into a routine of care until prevention becomes unremarkably dull. When life runs smoothly, it is almost always because someone, somewhere, thought about the door beforehand. Sueli and Walter drove back to Porto Alegre with the sun slanting across the windshield. The BR 101 highway had the same wind as always, the same trucks, the same smell of diesel and coffee. They stopped at an old rest stop, the kind with simple glass tumblers and buttered toast on the griddle. She raised her cup in a silent toast. He smiled from the corner of his mouth, adjusting his cap. Back home, they took off their coats, opened the windows, and let the smell of the street in. That night, a fine, steady rain began to fall, drumming on the tin roof. Sueli listened for a little while and then drifted off to sleep. She dreamed without fear of two people in light-washed jeans walking hand in hand down an ordinary street. The late afternoon light stretched their shadows long. There was no corridor, no loud noise, only a clear path ahead. The case of André and Camila never received a movie ending. No hidden culprit appeared. There was no late-night confession. What emerged was a possible truth, built from small footprints. The curiosity that pushes one forward, the heavy door, the sound that muffles everything, the haste that demands a cover-up. This doesn't lessen the gravity of what happened, it only explains it without lies. The country at times prefers the extraordinary to the probable. Here, the probable is what hurts. The sealed room became a lesson, and lessons, when they move from words into practice, are worth more than any monument. If this story has touched you and you wish to follow other narratives told with respect, investigation, and care, subscribe to the channel now. Share this video with those who work in events, parks, and schools, people who deal with doors, with the flow of crowds, and with maps every single day. And if you want to continue with this theme, I recommend the videos in our series on cases solved by forgotten details, and our special on escape routes in large public venues. Your engagement keeps these stories alive and makes a difference in the kind of prevention we all need to see.